In a world of giants, it takes a special kind of strength to stand tall and be heard. Join us as we tell the epic stories of modern-day titans who fought for their dreams against impossible odds. Subscribe today and find the titan living within yourself.
My husband's funeral was on a Thursday. By Saturday, my daughter-in-law was already asking about the beach house. She didn't ask me directly. That wasn't her style. She asked my son Daniel, loud enough for me to hear from the kitchen, while I was still in the black dress I'd worn to bury the man I'd spent 39 years of my life with. I heard her say, "Well, someone's going to have to deal with the property situation soon." I stood at the sink with my hands under running water and didn't say a word. That was 8 months ago. And looking back, that silence, that one moment, when I chose not to turn around and respond, may have been the smartest thing I ever did. My name is Margaret. I'm 68 years old. I taught high school English for 31 years in a small coastal town in North Carolina. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that I have read enough stories to know when I'm living inside one. I just didn't expect the villain to be someone who called me Mom. Let me go back to the beginning, because you need to understand who I was before all of this happened. Not the woman standing at the kitchen sink, numb and grieving. The woman before that. My husband, Robert, and I built our life slowly and deliberately, the way people from our generation did. We didn't inherit money. We didn't get lucky windfalls. Robert worked in marine engineering for 35 years, and I taught teenagers how to love literature. And together, dollar by dollar, we bought a small beach house on the Carolina coast. It wasn't grand. It was 3 bedrooms, a porch that faced the water, and a kitchen that always smelled like salt air no matter how many candles I burned. We called it our someday house for years before we could finally afford it. Robert retired first, and for 4 years, he sat on that porch every morning with his coffee and watched the waves. Those 4 years were the best of our lives. Then Robert had a stroke. And 18 months after that, he was gone. Daniel is our only child. He's 37, works in software, and he is, I want to be fair here, a genuinely good person at his core. He's kind. He's thoughtful in small ways. He calls on birthdays, and he remembers that I don't like cilantro. But he is also, and I say this with the full weight of a mother who raised him, profoundly conflict averse. He has never in his life been able to stand in a room where 2 people are upset and choose a side. He folds. He smooths. He says, I think everyone just needs to calm down when what the moment actually requires is for him to stand up straight and say something true. He met Renee at a work conference 3 years ago. She is 34, sharp, pretty in a way that photographs very well, and she has the specific kind of intelligence that immediately calculates what a room is worth. I noticed that about her the first time Daniel brought her home. She walked into our house, and her eyes moved just briefly, just barely to the square footage, the finishes, the view. Most people wouldn't have caught it, but I spent 31 years watching teenagers try to hide what they were thinking. And I caught it. I didn't say anything. She made Daniel happy, or seemed to, and I told myself I was being an unfair, suspicious mother-in-law. Which is a very easy story to tell yourself when you desperately want your son to be loved well. They got married 14 months ago. It was a beautiful wedding. I wore blue and I danced with Daniel, and I meant every word I said when I told Renee I was glad to have her in our family. The shift happened quietly, the way bad things usually do. It started with small comments. Daniel mentioned the beach house needs a new roof that must be so stressful to deal with alone. Or, at family dinners, have you thought about what makes sense, long term? Maintaining a second property is a lot for one person. She always said it gently. She always said it with her head tilted, and her voice soft. The way you speak to someone you're concerned about. And always, when Daniel was in the room, so he could hear. I noticed that too. She never said these things when Daniel had stepped away. It was a performance, and Daniel was the audience. I responded the way I'd been responding to things my entire life. I listened, I nodded, I said I appreciate the thought, and I went home, and I sat with it quietly. About 4 months after the wedding, Daniel called me on a Sunday evening. He sounded stiff, rehearsed, like he'd been talked through what he was going to say. He told me he and Renee had been doing some thinking, that phrase, doing some thinking. I knew it didn't originate with him, and that they were worried about me managing the beach house on my own. They thought it might be a good idea for the property to be consolidated under a shared arrangement. He used the word consolidated. Daniel doesn't use words like that. Renee does. I asked him what consolidated meant, specifically. He got quiet for a moment. Then he said Renee had spoken to a real estate attorney just informally, just to explore options, and that one possibility was transferring the title of the beach house into a joint family trust that Renee would help manage, since she had more bandwidth for that kind of thing right now. I sat with the phone pressed to my ear and I looked out my window at the dark street, and I thought very carefully before I spoke. I told Daniel I would think about it. He sounded relieved. He probably went back to Renee and told her it went well. I imagine she smiled. What I didn't tell him was that I had already thought about it 6 months earlier, while Robert was still in hospice. While I was sitting beside his bed at 2 a.m. and he was sleeping, and I was filling out paperwork with an estate attorney named Carol Simmons, who had an office above a sandwich shop downtown, and who had been practicing law for 40 years, and who looked me directly in the eye and said, "Margaret, do you have children?" And I said, "Yes, one son." And she said, "Is he married or planning to be?" And I said he was engaged. And she asked, without any further elaboration, "Do you trust her?" I paused. And Carol Simmons, who had seen 40 years of families and what they do to each other, nodded slowly and said, "Let's talk about how to structure this properly." The beach house was transferred into an irrevocable trust with my niece, Patricia, named as the successor trustee. Patricia is 51, lives in Raleigh, has her own home, and no interest whatsoever in the beach house for herself. She simply loves me and agreed to protect it. The transfer happened 4 months before Robert passed. The document was filed, recorded, and entirely legal. I was not hiding anything from anyone in a deceitful sense. I was simply making thoughtful arrangements, the way any 68-year-old woman with assets and a family in transition absolutely should. I did not tell Daniel. I did not tell Renee. I smiled at their wedding and danced and meant it all. After Daniel's Sunday phone call, Renee escalated. I think she sensed something wasn't moving fast enough. She started calling me herself. The calls were warm, chatty, full of questions about how I was sleeping and whether I was eating well, and had I considered joining a seniors group at the community center. The word seniors landed with a small, deliberate thud every time she used it. She was building something. I could feel the architecture of it even when I couldn't see the full structure yet. Then came the dinner. It was a Tuesday in March, about 7 months after the wedding. Daniel and Renee invited me to their house for dinner. Nothing special, Renee said. Just the 3 of us catching up. I brought wine and a candle. Renee had made a roast. We sat down, and for the first 20 minutes, it was genuinely pleasant, and I allowed myself to wonder, not for the first time, whether I had been too suspicious. Then Renee set down her fork. She said she needed to share something with me, because she cared about me and cared about our family. She said she'd been talking to a few people, she didn't say who, and she was worried about my ability to manage my finances and properties long term, especially given the stress of grief. She said the word cognitive once, briefly, like a stone she was testing the weight of before she threw it. I looked at Daniel. He was looking at his plate. Renee said she had done some research, again just informally, and that one option to protect me and ensure everything was managed properly would be for Daniel to be granted a durable power of attorney over my financial affairs, with Renee assisting him given her organizational strengths. I took a sip of the wine I'd brought. I set the glass down carefully. I looked at Renee and I said, "That's very kind of you to be concerned." I drove home and called Patricia that night. Patricia, who is not a woman who panics, said simply, "Good thing we already handled it. I want to tell you about what happened 6 weeks later, because this is the part I was not fully prepared for, even knowing what I knew. It was a Saturday morning in late April. I was at the beach house. I go there most weekends. I sit on the porch where Robert used to sit. I drink my coffee. I watch the water. And I let myself feel everything I need to feel. I was on that porch when I heard a car in the gravel drive. It was Daniel's car. I hadn't known he was coming. He got out first. Then Renee got out. Then a third person got out, a man in a gray suit carrying a soft leather briefcase, the kind of briefcase that announces itself as professional without being flashy. He was introduced to me as a document specialist. That was the phrase Renee used. Document specialist. I looked at my son. He couldn't quite meet my eyes. I invited them inside because I was raised with manners, and because I was not afraid. And those are two different reasons that happen to produce the same behavior. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Robert and I had eaten 1,000 quiet breakfasts, and Renee explained, in her calm, organized way, that she had consulted with a legal professional and that the most sensible arrangement for everyone would be for me to sign over management of the beach house property to a trust in Daniel's name. She slid a document across the table. The document specialist clicked his pen. I looked at the document. I looked at Renee. I looked at Daniel, who was sitting with his hands flat on the table and his jaw tight. And for just a moment, I saw something in his face that looked like shame. And I thought, good. Hold on to that. You're going to need it. Then I looked back at Renee and I said, very quietly, the beach house isn't mine to sign over. She blinked. What? The property was transferred into an irrevocable trust 8 months ago. I'm not the title holder. I don't have the legal authority to sign anything related to it. You'd need to contact the trustee. I paused. Her name is Patricia. I can give you her number if you'd like. The document specialist stopped clicking his pen. Renee's face did something complicated. The warmth drained out of it in a way that was almost interesting to watch. Like watching weather change over the water. What was underneath the warmth was not ugly exactly, it was just blank. Calculated. The face she wore when there was nothing left to perform. Daniel said, very quietly, Mom, when did you? Before your father passed, I said. Carol Simmons handled it. She's very good. Robert and I wanted everything properly arranged. The drive back to what I understood now was the real shape of my life began at that kitchen table on a Saturday morning in April. Renee stood up first. She said something about needing to review the situation with her own counsel. The document specialist put his pen in his pocket. Daniel remained at the table for another moment after they both moved toward the door, and he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was a small boy, and had done something he knew was wrong and couldn't find the words. I reached across the table and put my hand on top of his. I said, I know. He left. I went back to the porch. The water was doing what it always does, which is exactly what it wants, without apology. I sat in Robert's chair and drank the rest of my coffee and let the morning be what it was. In the weeks after, things moved the way things do when a plan fails, and nobody wants to talk about it directly. Renee became very busy. She stopped calling. Daniel called twice short calls. Careful calls. Calls where he asked how I was doing, and I said fine. And we both understood we were not yet at the place where the real conversation could happen. It happened on a Sunday, about 3 weeks later. He drove to the beach house alone. He sat on the porch with me, and for a long time neither of us said anything useful. Then he said, She told me you were declining, cognitively. He said the word like it tasted bad. She showed me things she'd written down. Incidents. I think she was constructing a record. I nodded. I had suspected as much. He said, I should have called you. I should have talked to you directly. A long time ago. I told him he was right, and that the fact that he hadn't told me something real about who he was in his marriage, and that I hoped that would change, because I would like to be in his life for a long time yet, and I would need to trust him to make that work. He cried. I let him. Then I made us sandwiches and we ate on the porch and watched the water, and it was the most honest 2 hours I'd had with my son in over a year. I don't know what the future holds for Daniel and Renee. That is his life and his marriage and his reckoning to have. What I know is that I did not sign anything. I did not panic. I did not make a single decision in grief that I would regret in clarity. I made my decisions in advance, quietly, with the help of a good attorney, and 40 years of understanding that the people who love you well don't need to be protected from your arrangements. Robert used to say that the smartest thing you could do in any negotiation was know your position before the other person knew there was a negotiation happening. He said it about engineering contracts. It turns out it applies to family too. I am 68 years old. I taught other people's children to read stories carefully, to look for what the author wasn't saying directly, to ask who benefits and who is made vulnerable, and what the structure underneath the surface reveals. I taught that for 31 years. Turns out I was paying attention the whole time. The porch light is on. The water is dark and moving. My coffee is hot, and this house that Robert and I bought dollar by dollar and called our someday house for years before it became our now house, is exactly where it has always been. It will stay that way. And some mornings, when the light is right and the air smells like salt, and I sit in his chair and close my eyes, I can almost hear him saying, "Good girl. You handled it." I think I did.